little out of breath from the bass playing. I forgot how this feels. I remember it well. At least it wasn't the drum set that I used to play up here during praise songs. While preaching regularly here for 12 years, we addressed a lot of topics. So, as a retiree preaching only now and then, I go shopping for subject matter, and I ask myself, well, what have I not preached here? What remains that I didn't cover during my working years? You see, I don't repeat sermons, and besides, I've convinced myself that you remember every little thing I said. So there's no need for me to repeat it again. Truth-telling, the funny thing is, at times, you do tell me about sermons you remember, and I'm honored, but usually have to admit it is I draw a complete blank. Gee, sorry, don't remember that at all, but it does sound like something I might have said. Not long ago, it dawned on me that never did I lay out for you in a comprehensive way my story, my faith journey, as we say, what would be part of my testimony, to use that good old traditional word. I've shared parts in this sermon or that, but I began to feel a little incomplete for not having done so. So here we go. Fasten your seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. A biographical flyby of one example of a ministry, okay? Part 1 this morning, part 2 next week. I told Beth, I can't do this in a sermon, but I can do it in 2. By the time we're done, you might wish I divided it up into 5. We'll see. My start in life may be the most important part. I was born into a Christian home. Ponder with me for a moment the sheer impact of this one piece, to be born into a waiting Christian environment. It is so formative. Equally formative, I was born into a church home, the Alpena, at that time, Methodist Church. We weren't united yet. Some would say, oh, never mind. I was infant baptized by Reverend Lees as he held me in his arms. Family lore says that I reached up and hugged him, and an awe waved through the church. I was 35, you see. What kind of sign is this infantile hugging on the preacher? A minister in the making? I would grow up on a steady diet of Sunday school, worship, youth fellowship. My mother was active in church. She was a praying woman. She taught us kids to be prayerful. And she steeped our family in the power of the music of the church. She sang in the choir, was a frequent soprano soloist. You may enjoy the highlight of her choral church music career. It was a kind of duet one Sunday morning. Her musical partner, our pet canary, Dickie Bird. When Mom would rehearse at home, this little songbird couldn't resist chirping along in time. Tweeting hadn't been invented yet. And he got so good at it that the music director invited Dickie Bird to accompany her upcoming solo. Some of you will remember how back in the 50s it was not unusual, Alex, if you agree, to hear organ music with a canary warbling along as a backup singer. Now, the burning musical question of the day was, in front of all those people in that foreign environment, would Dickie sing? Sure enough, they pulled it off. He was Tony Bennett. My sister, still an active member of that church and in that choir, tells me that old-timers up there still speak of this performance. I don't have any memory of it, only the family lore. So if you ask me what they sang, I don't know. Probably His Eye is on the Sparrow. Couldn't resist. My older sister was also active in church life and music. My brother wouldn't be born until 1953. Very different experiences. 2, my dad was a man of faith, raised in a Christian home, the son of a church organist. He was involved in church too, but not nearly so much. As a funeral director, he would say that every week he hears 3 to 5 sermons. Is there any need to hear any more? Later, I would challenge him. Dad, all you're hearing is funeral sermons. There's more to the gospel than that. Some of it's about life. It wasn't always easy being a UK, an undertaker's kid. Don't get me started. But after some years, I would come to appreciate the role the funeral home played in the development of my faith and my work. Not that I was inspired to become an undertaker, not for 1 minute. Funeral directing was never a fit for me. I'll say more about this later. I knew from a very young age it would not be who I am. Though to my surprise, part of it would turn out to be a good fit for me as a pastor that I would employ on a regular basis for almost 40 years, working with grieving families and planning services. It never ceased to amaze me how close to the funeral business I landed. But you see, the place was crawling with preachers. They were always coming and going from all manner of churches. I recognized most of them. I could call them by name. They came to meet with families. They came for visitation. They came for the funerals. I'd observe them at the cemeteries. Sometimes during services, I would sit, as a young teenager, I would sit in the funeral home garage by myself and eavesdrop on the sermons. Sometimes these preachers would end up the subject of our dinner time conversation. Not unlike today, hey? Where church folks still like to go out and have the minister for lunch. I'm going to be at your table. But I was a sponge, see? I was a sponge, soaking up all of these influences from home, church, the funeral home, even inspiring little Dickie Bird, may he rest in peace. You know, speaking of him, thanks to him, to this day, if somebody harps to me that religion is for the birds, to avoid a big old argument, I simply say, I think so too. And I have proof. Very fast forward. Following graduation from Michigan State, class of 68, go green, I find myself in seminary on a full ride scholarship, but not in the way you might think. Our north central jurisdiction of the Methodist Church offered a 1-year free ride at a Methodist seminary of choice designed for a graduate level student who had ever entertained thoughts of the ministry, who just wanted to try seminary on for size. It was exploratory, completely. And I was at the exploratory stage. So I applied. Again, to my surprise, I got it. But I'm not committed yet, not by a long shot. With God, I'm kind of, call me maybe. I came out of college with a pretty cocky, know-it-all case of senioritis. I had all the answers, if not a pretty healthy skepticism about many aspects of the Christian faith. Well, it did not take long for a powerful witness on the part of a brilliant faculty at Garrett, now Evangelical United Methodist Seminary on the campus of and affiliated with Northwestern University in Evanston. On the part of a brilliant faculty, professors so obviously smarter than me to work its effects upon me. They were wise, field-tested Christian apologists who'd heard all my answers before, and they had a few of their own. And they stood before this still impressionable young man as enlightened, responsible adult Christian models. Yes, that I hadn't seen in college, fair enough. And they were just what I needed. And I thank God for them to this day. And I re-upped and enrolled in the second and third years on my own. Witness here a reminder to us all of the power of the enlightened, responsible adult Christian model before impressionable young people and even crusty old-timers in a world so hungry to greet it. Now, if you will, a heads up, I want you to feel free as you listen to the following material. On one level, if you would please, be listening to me, and on the second level, feel free to do some reflecting on your own, which you probably would do anyway, upon your own life and your own experience in terms of this coming material. It is often in this kind of discussion that folks like to inquire about one's calling to the ministry. You know, how, when, and where did God call the pastor to the work? It's a good question. If one is a minister, isn't it fair to assume there was a divine call? They seem to go hand in hand. For 8 years, I was privileged to serve on our conference board of ordained ministry, processing incoming pastoral candidates who wanted to work in Detroit Conference churches. And one of the first items, asked of every single candidate was, tell us about your call. Now, of course, some of the stories, and frankly the stories, not so much clergy, I think, but especially lay people want to hear and expect to hear, are the dramatic bolt of lightning types. And of course, we have exciting, miraculous accounts of burning bushes and voices and signs from God calling persons to service. See Moses, Jesus' baptism, Paul's conversion, the conversion of Constantine. I remember one fellow student at Garrett that freshman year telling us how he was out working in his yard one afternoon in what would have been an original start-out career, when all of a sudden he heard a loud noise. Something struck him from behind. He was thrown to the ground. And as he lay there stunned, he heard a voice loud and clear telling him that he was to become a minister. He was to begin planning immediately, and if there were obstacles, not to worry, God would see him through. And there had been many obstacles, and sure enough, there he was with us beginning his studies. And his was not the only such story. Clearly, some men and women receive these dramatic signs, and they receive them on a day, at an hour, in a way that, understandably, they never forget. That said, there is a degree of subjectivity. It's all shrouded in considerable mystery, I think. In some cases, persons will tell you these experiences demonstrate the extent to which God had to go to get their attention. On the human side, maybe they're about the extent to which we have to go to convince ourselves that it's okay to drop what we're doing, change course and life and work for the sake of our faith. Of course, what we interpret as a calling isn't foolproof either. Story goes of a new pastor who was working in his church for 2 years, but things weren't going well. There were a lot of complaints about his sermons. He wasn't working and playing well with others. They weren't raising the budget. Membership was shrinking. So the personnel committee sat down with him in kindness and a spirit of love and confronted him with these concerns. Pastor, they said, we're just not so sure this is the line of work you should be in. Maybe it's not who you are after all. He replied, well, golly, I don't know. I mean, I received that call from God. You know, I told you about it. That time I looked up in the sky and I saw these 2 giant letters, PC. I took it to mean preach Christ. They scratched their heads for a minute and said, yeah, well, we've been thinking about that. And we're just wondering, are you open to the possibility that in your case it stood for plant corn? Well, what we do know is that while every pastor should be Christian, not every Christian should be a pastor. We know that every Christian is called to be in a ministry which is a good fit for him or her. Maybe a work inside the church, maybe outside the church. St. Paul speaks of the call to specialization under the general Christian calling umbrella. You know, once we decide to be a follower of Jesus Christ, we need to narrow that down to just what we're going to do about it in our lives. Paul spells out a number of examples. Ephesians 4, verse 11. Some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. Similarly, in our lesson this morning, we see that Jesus called his disciples, in this case clearly a reference to some larger group of his general following, and from them he chose 12 to be apostles. It means the sent ones. It's this specialization, you see, where it's appropriate. So once again, we have God's general following to follow Christ, and ideally within that, we choose how we shall serve. Some kind of volunteering, some giving back, a work of love, a prayer life, something specialized to our gifts, our interests, our circumstances that fits and expresses who we are. Because we persons are unique, each call is unique. It is unrealistic to expect everyone to receive the same kind of call. Therefore, it is unfair to judge the calls that were dramatic, thunder and lightning, as somehow higher or more legitimate than those that were quieter. It is also unfair to judge the more down to earth, if you will, as somehow less. Biblically, we see that God has the whole range of tools as needed in his kit bag. So we have the supernatural and exciting, we have the quieter, and we even have a blend of the two. Jesus calls Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, for example, simply by saying, "Follow me," and they drop what they're doing and follow. Pretty quiet. It's also miraculous. It's also pretty miraculous. What? Reminds me of the wonderful, wonderful old hymn I learned as a boy in the Alpena Methodist Church. Jesus calls us. Want to tune in? O'er the tumult of our lives' wild, restless sea, day by day his sweet voice soundeth, saying, "Christian, follow me." Now, the ways he gets us into ministry after we're called and clarified the call are expressed over a broad spectrum, many ways. Once upon a time, there was a farm family who invited their new pastor to dinner. He was known to have a pretty healthy appetite, and so they were ready for him, eager to please and to show him how much they appreciated his ministry. So, they whipped up a lovely chicken dinner with all the trimmings: mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, corn muffins, fresh vegetables from the garden, home-baked apple pie, and a nice French vanilla ice cream for a la mode. And as to the entree itself, not one, mind you, but two freshly sacrificed free-range chickens. And of this dish alone, the pastor had 3 helpings. "My goodness, that baked chicken is delicious. Would you pass it just one more time?" When evening was over and it was time for pastor to go, they walked him to the front porch and were saying their goodbyes. Standing there, what do they see but a big old hen walking across their path with her chest all puffed up, kind of haughty-like, a little arrogant, downright stuffy, and strutting like she was just so proud of something. Said the preacher, "Well now, what do you suppose got into her?" And the farmer's wife said, "Oh, she's got a son and a daughter in the ministry." See? Well, it might happen at the dinner table. You don't know when. It has always seemed to me quite clearly that for the most part, our life's calling, not only on the level of how to serve within the faith, but even our workaday lives, our jobs, our occupation, that calling comes less from the outside in and more from the inside out, as we journey inward to the place where our Creator has planted our calling within our identity, to discover more and more whom we are from our birth, in native inclinations, gifts, and graces. And then once we've made the self-discovery, we start to look outward within the faith, within the workaday world, to find where in the world our puzzle piece fits once we're schooled and trained and ready. And along the way we learn so much, and we hone the skills, and then we hope and pray to find the blessings of resources and opportunity. In this way, I believe God calls us not just to ministries, but to wherever we fit in a work or a lifestyle that expresses whom God has made us to be. So much is said about God calling ministers. Does anybody ever sit down with a teacher, a technician, a mechanic, a factory worker, a carpenter, a farmer, a doctor, a house mom or a house dad, a salesperson, an inventor, a chef, a writer, any artiste, and ask them about their calling? I believe our God has planted within us all the calling of a unique person waiting to be uncovered and expressed. And we see evidence in all kinds of endeavors, works large and small, in people who are just so naturally good at what they do, and they love what they do, and they put themselves fully into their work or lifestyle. Why? Because they're bringing to light and to fruition their God-given identity, this inward spark that longs to be honestly and outwardly portrayed. It is no accident that our word vocation, also its first cousin avocation, are rooted in the Latin vocare, which means to call. Obviously, this whole subject is very big. It's multi-layered. For instance, I know what it is to experience levels of call. That is, I found that parish ministry expressed a large part, a high level of who I am, but not all parts of me. So from time to time, not unlike many clergy friends I know when we are alone and can really feel free to be honest with each other, would wonder, what about being a teacher? What's it really like? I have some interests in that, maybe some skills. What's it like to be a full-time counselor? I have interest in that, maybe some gifts or graces. What's it like to be a writer? I'm interested in that. I do some writing. Or maybe a musician. I have a lot of interest in that, maybe enough gifts. And on the flip side, I never had to wonder for a minute about being an undertaker. It was out of the question. I always knew what I was not called to. You know, call me not maybe, you know. Or maybe it's not realistic for our call to be our occupation. We got to eat, right? So maybe we work at a job, but then express ourselves honestly in a sideline, a hobby, a volunteering, an avocation. Ask almost any artiste. You can go back farther in time than the present. St. Paul was a tent maker. First Christian missionary on a global level in that day. It's the notion of the worker priest. Pastors who work 20, 30, 40 hours at another job and then do the church best they can, you know. Or maybe we're in a position not to have to work, which frees us all the more to the avocation. Calls may come very early in life, even childhood. Calls may come later in life, or it may be later in life we recognize them, or maybe later in life we find the courage to risk fulfilling them. Calls change. Calls may conflict. For example, I know that God sometimes has to say to us, yes, it's true, I did call you to the work and lifestyle that you have developed, but now I need you to be primary caregiver in this situation. So, whatever we're doing, part of faithfulness is keeping the phone nearby and charged. At any time, we may get a call. The example of our Lord is always intriguing. Many Christians arguably believe that he received his calling as an adult, in and through experiences culminating in his baptism. It is at baptism Mark begins his gospel. It's to the effect that after a 30-year career as a carpenter and stonemason, he was called to his public ministry. Mark says it was at his baptism that the heavens were torn apart. God's Spirit descended like a dove upon him, and there was a voice. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Mark 1, 10 and 11. Here's a case study in my story then, toward my conclusion. I never heard a loud and mysterious noise. I never got thrown to the ground. I never heard a voice commanding me to go here and do that. I saw no signs in the heavens. To me, it's enough to see the heavens in and of themselves. So in my rearview mirror, as regards my personal call, I see God using process. Many things unfolding over years, involving the planting of seeds, influences leaning upon me, natural-born interest, gifts, graces, home and family, a funeral home, a fun and caring church, pastors who took me under their wing, schools, a scholarship just to try things on, wonderful people in wonderful churches who kept supporting me and rewarding me in meaningful work. And when all's said and done, isn't all of our work and lifestyle something like a marriage? Not only do we choose it on a wedding day, but we go on to continue to choose it every single ensuing day. We note that Jesus' calling is a powerful illustration of both process, raised in a family of faith, trained in the practices of faith and in the Scriptures, and the supernatural, the opening of the heavens and God's voice. It seems so right, doesn't it, that our Lord would experience the power of the whole spectrum. But in my case, again, processes. You're familiar with the metaphor. Doors that opened, doors that closed. Doors that locked, doors that reopened. and choices I made along the way, whether just to take a peek or to walk through. In the rearview mirror, what I see most clearly in retrospect is the hand of God upon my life to the present. Because I ponder that for all of my extra church wondering and exploring, twice I went back to graduate school for 2 different masters. Part of it to augment my ministry, yes, and part of it to still kind of figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. For all of my extra church wondering and some active exploring over the years, I never left. I never left the ministry. And it wasn't for want of interest or gifts or resources or opportunity and a few open doors. I just believe that by way of quietly working with me, it is where God wanted me to be all along. After all, case in point, I stand before you this morning as a retiree with a good, full life. I didn't have to be here this morning, and I didn't have to sign up for next Sunday. Or did I? Amen. Amen.